Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Alejandro Alfaro-Santiz. My pronouns are he, his, él, de él.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 6th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 14, or Proper 9, which this year falls on July 4th. Brief content notifications for you. In our deep dive, there is a use and explanation of the word illegal, specifically around immigration. And in our gospel reading, we talk about the dangers with immigration, and especially immigration across borders.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
We are excited today to have as our special guest Reverend Alejandro Alfaro-Santiz, who is a human being living in Des Moines, Iowa, with his spouse, 2 boys, and a dog. He happens to be an ordained United Methodist clergy and is the lead pastor at Trinity Las Americas United Methodist Church, a multicultural, bilingual, progressive, and affirming inner-city congregation in Des Moines. And he's my colleague. Anyway, welcome. It is good to have you on our podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Our readings for today have to do with the movement of people, both in terms of the Babylonian exile and being exiled and returning from it, and being sent as a prophet to the people of Israel, as well as in Mark, where Jesus sends out the 12 dependent on the hospitality of strangers. You are an immigrant in Iowa, of all places, which I've talked about at a variety of points in our podcast, so our listeners are pretty familiar with our racist legislation and statewide government. But I'm curious what your experience has been like as an immigrant in this country, not just in Iowa, but also for the time that you've been.
So I've been living in the U.S. for 11 years now, and I spent 2.5 years in Denver and the rest in Iowa, 1 in Ames and the rest here in Des Moines. And so in Denver, I found my group of people fairly quickly, people who were really focused on social justice, doing theater, like street theater. The youngest member was 6 months old. Lily was a newborn baby. And the oldest, Helen, was 89. Mm-hmm. And it's amateur theater, but it was amazing. So I had a very good experience of meeting diverse people and people who are committed to helping others. I've also experienced racism, and yet I think being a cisgender male, being Christian, being, college educated, I mean, there's a lot of layers of privilege that I experience things differently than somebody who may have a different experience than I do. I know I experienced a lot of racism through the lives of the people I serve. The first thing that comes to mind is when Donald Trump got elected, people from the congregation I serve who have lived here for years and years and years and take the bus every day and never had an issue, like public transportation, people were yelling at them like, when are you going to go back to Mexico? Regardless of if they were Mexican or not, sometimes they were, sometimes they were not. So the other thing that comes to mind is what another immigrant told me when I just moved to Iowa. And she said that Iowans are very friendly, but they will not be your friends. Which I think that explains a lot of the Iowanize.
Yes. Yeah. I frequently say that being nice is a sin. And it's that sort of niceness that, right? Like, I'll be friendly and I'll be nice to your face, but behind your back, I'm not going to, or I'm not going to actually try to be in relationship with you in any sort of meaningful way. I just want you to think that I like you. And I want you to like me.
And what blows my mind is that there are Iowans who think that being Iowanized is a good thing.
Right?
Yeah.
There are Minnesotans that think the same thing about being Minnesota nice.
Oh, Minnesota nice is also about 3 levels up from that in terms of just sheer passive aggressiveness. But
so maybe it's a Midwest thing.
Midwestern nice is definitely a thing. I grew up in Illinois, and oh my goodness, it's the one difference between Illinois and Minnesota for me is that in Illinois, if someone is angry with you, they will eventually tell you. It may take a while, but they will tell you. In Minnesota, you will never know. until they die or until their family kills you.
I think it's also connected to white people, right? So it's Midwestern white people.
Nice. Yeah.
True. I think about how Native American people had like this, I don't know, for lack of a better word, justice resolution, like restorative justice type of thing. Whenever somebody wrongs someone, instead of being mad and not telling the person or just lashing out, they involve the whole community and there's reconciliation as the goal.
Yeah, versus the dominant U.S. justice is
punitive.
If you do something bad to someone else, the state punishes you and fines you and all of this stuff. And there's no rebuilding community, refinding community. Anymore.
The state is going to kill you to prove that killing people is wrong.
Yes.
Exactly.
So on a personal level, too, I haven't thought about this in a long time. I swear I would never study in the U.S., let alone live in the U.S., right? And, I think God has a sense of humor because I end up living here and studying here and then living here. And the very first day I moved, I was getting down the plane in Denver airport and I got into a share ride van. And there was a family there and then they picked me up. And the dad was on his phone. The mom was on her phone. And they had 2 kids, and both were in some sort of tablets or something. And I, wanted to say hi or something, but they literally were just like, and I thought, oh yeah, I have to remember I'm in the U.S. and in the U.S. everybody's glued to their phones and they don't, talk to people and blah, blah, blah. But that was a good lesson for me about not judging people without knowing them, because as it turned out, Denver airport is very far from Denver. It's like a half an hour, 45-minute drive. As it turned out, the family was super friendly. We did have an amazing conversation, and it just happened that they were very stressed because they had rented a car and they were not sure whether the ride would make it on time before they closed, because from the same company, renting the car in the airport was twice as much. And so the dad and the mom both were trying, to connect with somebody and try to get a hold of someone. And the kids had a long flight and they needed to be distracted. But one of the kids gave me like a Brontosaurus figure rubber band that I still carry with me. I mean, I don't carry it with me. I still have it. I don't carry it with me because I would lose it. But for me, that's a reminder to not be quick to judge people, because I know I can very easily fall into that. Like I see somebody doing X, Y, Z and start having all these ideas in my head. And if I don't know the person and I'm not in relationship with them, how can I know why they're doing what they're doing, right? So that has served me to know that sometimes people who are racist or are hostile to immigrants, it's because they don't know anyone. And maybe I've tried sometimes to get to know people and they've had bad experiences with a person that happened to be an immigrant, but that doesn't mean that, everybody should be put in the same page. So that's a good reminder when you asked me about, the questions you asked me, what were my experience as an immigrant in this country?
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me of the gospel reading where Jesus is sending out the 12 in pairs, so 6 groups out, and says, don't bring anything extra. Trust in the hospitality of wherever you go. If they welcome you, stay there for as long as you're there. If they don't, shake the dust from your feet, keep going. And that sense of like, how long do you wait to see if they're going to welcome you, right? Did the 12 go out and go to the town square and wait there for half an hour, for 5 hours? Like, how long do you wait to see if someone's going to give you hospitality, if somebody's going to engage with you and talk to you about the rental car that is stressing them out or whatever the case may be? And there's that where if you're in a certain town, are the disciples going to be like, okay, we can wait for 5 minutes and then we're out of here? And other parts, like other towns, they'll be like, oh, we can stay for 5 hours and see if anybody picks it. And I don't know. I think it's those dynamics of like, how do we welcome people and how do we receive welcome?
And it's so hard. I mean, as you shared this, I just remember there's this lady from the congregation that moved to a new house. This was many, many years ago, before even I was there. But this is a famous story that has been shared about how she moved to a new place in Des Moines and she was excited and she brought, tomatoes to her neighbor, and her neighbor being not nice. She was like, I don't like tomatoes. And it was obviously that it was because she was an immigrant. And so the next week she baked something and she brought like a baked type of bread and she dismissed her too. She didn't get it. And it's amazing that she kept doing this for so many weeks that eventually the way this person shares her story is that now every summer she's the one that brings me, XYZ. So they end up becoming, I don't know if friends, but they end up becoming friendly. The neighbor eventually accepted her gifts and started to bring her gifts back. But I'm just amazed. I learned so much from the people I serve because I would never have that patience. I mean, if I bring something person and the person dismisses, I would not do it again. But yeah, that's the question you asked about how long do we stay until we're welcome is what made me think about that story.
Yeah.
Aggressive generosity.
Aggressive generosity. And it's this complicated space of like the culture is so hostile that immigrants have to be
extra nice,
so much more assertive just to establish a place. Whereas I can move into a place. Admittedly, I'm an introvert. I don't want to know my neighbors. I don't know my neighbors. That is not my goal. I know people and communities and people that I work with and stuff, but I don't know my neighbors, and I don't want to know my neighbors really. So I'm not going to be the one to bring over stuff. But if somebody brought it to me, I would appreciate it. But nobody's going to be hostile to me, at least not on first sight. They might once they get to know me and once I put the rainbow flag up. But it's not going to be I need to do this in order to wear somebody down to get them to stop being racist.
And this was like 12, 15 years ago. I wonder even now with everything being harder. Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's good to think is that the narrative in general is stacked against immigrants, right? Whether it's in the movies, in, the political discourse, in all the laws that are being passed in Congress here in Iowa and in many other states. So it's not easy for sure.
Yeah. Nobody's tailoring their campaigning to immigrants because they're not voting. Yeah. Which, there are plenty of us who care about immigrants who are voting, but we haven't figured out yet how to have our voices be loud enough with immigrant voices for it to actually make a difference.
And for that matter, there are immigrants who are voting. And
also true.
Yeah. And I think about Iowa Migrant Movement for Justice, a new organization that got Justice for Neighbors and American Friends Service Committee merged into one. They do an amazing, amazing work.
Yeah, I love the work that they do. Iowa MMJ,
yeah. Another thing that it's interesting that it happened, I used to travel a lot to the U.S. because I used to work for a nonprofit in Guatemala that does long-term relationships between, communities in Central America and churches in the U.S. from a Christian perspective, ecumenical. And it always baffled me. Like I would usually get to the U.S. through Houston and I would see the officer, when I come to customs and a guy who looked Latino, his name tag said, for example, Jose Lopez. And he was talking in Spanish to the person next to him. And then I would come and he would start asking me things in English, like, where are you going? How long are you staying here? And all these things. And I would answer in Spanish and he would still keep asking in English. He would never talk to me in Spanish, knowing that, like my passport is like, hey, I'm coming from Guatemala. I'm Guatemalan. You speak Spanish. And so I started to realize that there's a lot of people that say that sometimes if immigrants that don't have papers, once they have papers, they become hostile to immigrants without documents or people who are second, third generation. Yeah. And I think, and this is just a hunch, based on what I've seen and experienced, is that even if you are like 4th or 5th generation Hispanic descendant or Latino, Latinx, even if you never cross the border, but the border crossed you, and you end up being suddenly in the U.S. and your family, end up being suddenly in the U.S., and so therefore, you're a citizen and your parents have been citizens and your grandparents have been citizens and your great-grandparents have been citizens, even with all those things, they still experience a lot of racism. And the whole narrative that's against immigrants, right? Like we don't have anything in our forehead that says citizen or non-citizen, right? So there's a lot of judgment by how people look or if they speak Spanish or they don't speak Spanish or, even though immigrants, of course, are not just from Latin America, they're all from all over the world. But I talk about my experience as a Latinx person. So long story short, I think what happens is that these people experience a lot of racism and prejudice. And in a subconscious way, they may think, okay, if undocumented immigrants stopped coming, people would stop being racist against me, and then I wouldn't have to deal with all this crap. So I don't want any more undocumented immigrants to come so that I can have a better life. But the sad thing is, regardless of whether there's immigrants or not more immigrants, racism will still exist if we don't address it, right? And these people, even though they may be third, fourth, fifth generation, they will still experience racism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the divide and conquer, right? If white supremacy can pit undocumented immigrants against documented immigrants, against citizens, whether they've been citizens for a day or for longer, then all of that infighting keeps everyone from actually like addressing the white supremacy that's demanding that of them.
The same way that American white supremacy has been pitting lower class white Americans against Americans of all other races for since time immemorial.
Yeah.
So I've had a lot of conversations with people about immigration over the years, generally with white people, generally with rural Midwestern white people. And I occasionally enjoy derailing those conversations by responding to their comments about immigrants with stories about a friend of mine who is a white European woman who immigrated to the U.S. in order to marry her American husband because he couldn't move to her country. She is still angry that she had to leave her home health system, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
I would be too.
Yeah. And oddly enough, when I bring her up in these conversations about immigration, often people will have a vastly different opinion of her than they do of many other groups of immigrants who also happen to not share her skin color, weirdly enough.
What a surprise.
Yeah. So, do you have any further comments about the many social forces that impact how immigrants might be viewed by the population in their new homes?
Well, I mean, there's all this intersectionality, right? Like race, gender. At Trinity Las Americas, we walk with two transgender women that came from Central America and Mexico. And immigrants have a really hard story, like undocumented immigrants. But then you add being transgender and an immigrant, and it's just like all these other things.
Sure.
It's very complicated. And I think we need to talk more about all these things because even in progressive circles, people don't realize how all these things intersect and how they affect one another. And the other thing that reminded me when you were sharing, Kay, I don't know if this is still true. This was true when I was in seminary in 2013. So I guess I should Google it or do some research. But at that time, I always enjoy asking people which one was the biggest group of undocumented people in the U.S. And that's people from Mexico. And yes.
Oh.
And the second biggest undocumented group in the U.S., guess from where?
Canada.
My thought would be like the original Puritans. It's not like they had
neighbors, but it's like nowadays.
Oh, modern.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
That is a great question.
Irish people. Things were so hard
I have heard those stories.
In Ireland in terms of financial that a lot of people came to the US. They didn't need a visa, right? They just came. They could stay over the 90 days. And of course, they'll have to pay a fine, but nobody will ask them for their papers. They're white. They speak English. Some people like their accent. So they even had an easier time. And so there's a lot of, at that time, I don't know where that's true still today, but there were a lot of Irish people undocumented here in the US, but nobody would, mess with them or ask them for their papers or anything.
Actually, that still happens. My husband's best friend lives in Boston, and a vast number of Irish people come over undocumented during the summer to work in the coastal port towns on the East Coast, and then go back, and they make money hand over fist because everyone wants to hire someone with an Irish accent, and no one cares about their papers.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's...
That's fascinating. I hit Google while you were talking because I was like, now I want to know what the next one is.
Canadians? No, I mean, why would they want to come here? They have good healthcare.
Exactly. That was my exact thought, yes.
Yeah, Mexico, the Northern Triangle. I don't know what they mean by Northern. Oh, that's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Yeah, the rest of them are all broken up into multiple countries. So it's hard to get just this one, then this one, then this one. Well, and what I was thinking about was the number one way people come who end up being undocumented immigrants is actually on tourist visas.
Oh, yeah.
They fly in and then they just overstay their visa.
Which that's why building a border wall is a dumb idea. It's like...
Right, that's why it was 100% racism, right? Like, it wasn't about anything else.
And when you look at the percentages of the American illegal immigrants to Mexico, it's amazing.
Yeah, the trend is actually that more people are going to Mexico than are coming from Mexico to the U.S.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of migration back and forth, but yeah.
Well, and another thing, like to think about the former president, right? Wanted to build this wall because was against immigrants. His wife is an immigrant. His mother was an immigrant. So it was funny when he proposed that, immigrants.
When his wife was an undocumented immigrant.
Yes, true. She worked without papers, yes. But yeah, when he was proposing, like, immigrants and their kids should be deported.
But like for his political.
Yeah.
That's your kids.
And I tried to find this Twitter account before we started recording, but I haven't been able to yet. But I do love, there's a Twitter account where the person behind it specializes in looking up the records, genealogical, and then the legal immigration papers of people who propose anti-immigration legislation. And the number of legislators who make these horrible anti-immigration laws who have illegal immigrants on their family trees is astounding.
I was going to say...
immigrants.
Yes. It's not illegal to be human.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
But that's also the language that they use.
Yeah.
That the legislators generally use. Yeah. Not the Twitter account.
Yeah. Yeah, but right, like Ted Cruz is.
And I was thinking, like, there's people who become very, like, okay, I don't know if it was the Associated Press or Winston. Okay, so we're going to call people illegal immigrants. We're going to call, like, illegal immigration, which I think that's still... It's a very bad thing. And by the way, I'm not sure whether which press group or which news source is the one that still doesn't refer to humans as illegal immigrants, but it uses the term for immigration illegal. Because up to today, June 23rd of 2021, to be in the U.S. without a document, it's not a crime. It would be the equivalent of a speeding ticket, right? And so if you're speeding and you get caught and you get a fine, you're not an illegal driver. You just got a fine. But so it was like in time of one of the two Bushes president that there was a Republican strategist that on purpose said we need to start using the term illegal when connected to immigrants so we can stoke fear. There's a whole memo. If you Google that, I'm sure that's easy to find. That shows how using illegal connected to immigration is not just, somebody thought about that or just, it's a well-planned strategy.
Yeah. And I think it was W is my guess, but George W. Bush. Yeah. But yeah, and I've seen and had those stickers that say no human being is illegal because it is that. And that's one of the things that I've told many of people of it's literally a fine to do. Now, there's all sorts of stuff that has been built up as that fear mongering has increased, right? To make it into, but we can get it so that they have a felony if we do this and we twist this. But yeah, it's just frustrating it's that. And then also like when we decide who goes to jail and who doesn't is connected to that, right? If it's just a fine, you shouldn't have to put someone in jail. But that's increasingly what is being done. There's increasing monitoring and all of that for whoever. They also do it with protesters and all of that stuff. But
but in the U.S., since forever, the whole private prison of immigrants, it's a business. They get paid $135 per person per night. Like these facilities with Geo Center, the Geo facilities, GeoCorp, and there's another couple ones. And there's a piece of legislation that says that at any given point, there has to be a minimum of so many people. So there's like a quota. And regardless of if they have that number of people or not, the government pays these corporations this amount of money. And so, of course, they always try to get more people so they'll get paid more, but it's disgusting.
Yeah, it's the ways that the for-profit prison industry and the prison industry in general all mix together to harm everybody. And it's so insidious. It gets into every facet of our lives. It's not just crime. It's also the way that the war on drugs became a war against poor people and against Black and brown people. And then also immigration became criminalized. And each thing just continues to support to the extent that we have more people in jail now than were enslaved during slavery. And the only place the Constitution allows slavery is
inside
when you're in jail.
Meanwhile, in the U.S., if you're an employer who steals from your employees by, say, withholding wages, you pay a fine, and if you're an employee who steals from your employer, you go to jail.
Yep. Yeah. Same $100. One person goes to jail, the other maybe pays half of it back.
Yeah.
If you're lucky.
And like 10 cents to a lawyer. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. this country. Why would anybody come here? I mean, there are lots of important reasons because we do a lot worse things also in other countries.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, I had a professor in seminary that always said very clearly that he's from Cuba, Miguel de la Torre. Why would people be surprised that people from Latin America and other countries want to come to the U.S. if these corporations and with the blessing of the government went into other countries and stole natural resources and just leave a trail? And so people are just coming here looking for what was taken from our countries. So the matter is not about offering hospitality to immigrants, because you offer hospitality when you assume that what you had is yours. But immigrants are just coming for what is theirs. So that was very eye-opening. So he always was against, like, don't call it hospitality, because this country was built on stealing from other countries. So it's not like it's yours.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, because it is. That's what the United States has done, both militarily and corporately, like capitalistically. Yeah. Like, we go in and we prop up military dictatorships. We make space for multinational corporations to come in and completely decimate the environment, the economy, right? I went to Mexico when I was in seminary with a group of high schoolers to do a cultural immersion leadership program. And at that time, I think it's still the case, it was actually cheaper to buy corn from the U.S. than it was, like, to buy corn and tortillas from the U.S. than it was to buy them locally at the markets, because U.S. corporations had manipulated corn and with subsidies NAFTA, and all of that so much.
And the thing with that as well is that you may buy corn, but then you can't save some of the kernels to plant for next season because it's genetically modified. So you have to buy it again. And not to mention the whole cultural aspect of your relationship with corn and food and growing your own food. And yeah.
Happy 4th of July. I mean, but that's part of it. It was intentional for us to choose this topic on the 4th of July not because the United States is made up of immigrants, because we are not. We are made up of Native people who have been here since well before any settlers. We're made up of people who were kidnapped and enslaved and brought over here. And we are made up of immigrants.
Yes, I love that you mentioned that, because whenever somebody says, like, we're a nation of immigrants, I've just, because there's a lot of people who didn't choose to come here. Yeah. They were brought by force, and a lot of people who were here before too. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, as long as we can draw a straight line between smallpox blankets and Coca-Cola hiring death squads in Latin America, we can't really celebrate America without knowing who America is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Speaking of immigration, and also speaking of joyfully derailing conversations about immigration in ways that bother other people, I've had a number of conversations about immigration, again, mostly with white people, often with white, rural, Midwestern people, that have gotten very muddled due to the other person not fully considering the differences between, say, refugees, who are often also immigrants, and immigrants, not all of whom are refugees. When you write immigration policy, you have to write policy that can delineate between the two, among others. And so I was wondering, Pastor Alejandro, if you've also had these muddled conversations, and do you have any tips on how to clear them up in ways that make my brain hurt less, or any thoughts on how to address these awkward conversations?
Well, there's different angles to consider the immigrant and refugee conversation. In terms of policy, you have to note the difference. And I think one problem with that, from my perspective, is that my experience is more with city folks, not rural areas as much. And so even folks who are not really sympathetic toward immigrants, who said, oh, refugees, oh yeah, they came the right way. They did it the right way, so they should be welcome here. But immigrants, so they associate immigrants with undocumented people, and refugees are different. And from my perspective, we're all immigrants. And then just to muddy the waters more, there's a lot of climate refugees with all the storms that have been happening in Central America since the last couple of decades. There's also refugees from violence. I mean, in the congregation I serve, there's a person whose son got killed by gangs because the U.S. process for this person to bring her son was so long that they ran out of time. And they've been in the process for 7 years. So I guess my thing would be just to encourage people just to use the term immigrant without making a distinction. And I would say that because some people tend to think like refugees are okay, immigrants are not. And I guess if I understood where you're coming from, some people may think refugees and immigrants are the same. I don't want anyone.
Yeah, well, or the number of conversations I've had with people who did refugee work several decades ago with, say, the waves of Latvian refugees. That in my area of Minnesota, there were several groups of Latvian refugees that were resettled in the area. And they are so proud that they helped resettle those families. Meanwhile, 2 generations later, all of those Latvians have left because it wasn't actually that great for them to live here. They've moved to cities. And secondly, these very same people are objecting to refugee communities who happen to have slightly different skin tones than them, who are either in their neighborhoods or in the local cities. And it's just exhausting.
It's like racism and white supremacy again, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And I remember when I was serving in rural Minnesota, there were a couple congregations in the southeastern Minnesota Synod that were made up mostly, if not entirely, of South Sudanese refugees. And what's fascinating about that in particular is, so the continent of Africa was carved up by colonizers, and the church carved it up along those lines. So wherever Germany colonized, Lutherans would be, and wherever England colonized, the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church would be, and that sort of thing. And so Sudan is not a place where there's a history of Lutheranism. But Lutheran World Relief and Lutheran Disaster Response are actually pretty solid organizations. And when they send blankets for refugees in refugee camps and those sorts of things to care for people, they always put Lutheran World Relief or Lutheran Disaster Response on them. And so people kept seeing Lutheran. And so when they were resettled in Minnesota, they went to the Lutheran Church because they had seen that the Lutherans, and the ELCA has this problem right now also with LGBTQ stuff, right? We're telling people that it's okay to come to Lutheran churches because nationally we're putting things out during Pride Month that queer people are cool. But realistically, 9% of our congregations are reconciling congregations, so have done the work to welcome LGBTQ people. So it's a thing that Lutherans do a lot. But in Minnesota, it happened that then people actually were able to start a smaller worshiping community in relationship with another one, and it was able to grow. And so it became this beautiful thing, but it definitely was not an intentional evangelism. It wasn't an intentional outreach by any of the congregations or people in those communities who benefited from these immigrants coming and finding place there and finding home and welcome. And I think there are some congregations that do that, and there are a lot of congregations that don't. And there are some congregations that just get surprise benefits from the bigger work that other people do.
Yeah.
I also think the other thing that I think about, when I think about rural conversations about immigration is the number of people that say, but I live in this rural town and it's so homogenous. Everybody is white.
Except they're not, because I was getting gas 2 days ago and the family in the car next to me was speaking Spanish to each other.
Right? But particularly when it comes to undocumented immigration, right? We have so many agribusinesses in this country, especially dairy in Minnesota, and it is safer, right? It is safer for undocumented people to be in the shadows. Yep. And so there's a reason why white people who aren't paying attention can not notice those things. But the diversity exists in every town. There is no town that is 100% white unless they're like actually a KKK town that has kicked out everybody, right?
Yeah.
But people just don't see them, choose not to see them, or forget that they are the employers of Mexican immigrants or Guatemala, like wherever they might be from. The ones that I was thinking of were from Mexico. And so it's just this space where it's like, okay. And the congregation I served there before I got there had that moment of realization, like, there are groups of people that come on worker visas to the local farm during harvest season. And there are folks who work at the dairies. Has anybody actually welcomed them? And they were like, I don't think anybody has. And so the congregation did. And it's actually a beautiful ministry and a beautiful example of actually paying attention to who's around you and welcoming welcoming people, not with expectations of you're going to join the church or whatever, but we're going to welcome you. We're going to have a party every time you come, and we're going to have a party before you leave every year, and we're going to try and get together between that and hang out and get to know each other and build relationships. And I think that's the work that white people and citizens in the U.S. of all races are responsible for. It shouldn't just be, right, the woman from the congregation who's bringing tomatoes and pies and like all of the great things. It should be the other way around. The tradition is when someone moves in, the neighbors bring
like a welcome
that person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I will find a baked good you like, and I don't care how long it will take until I do.
Yeah. So, Alejandro, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Well, I was thinking, for the people who are listening, if you've never met an immigrant before, and I don't mean like you were shopping and the person next to you was an immigrant, but if you've never had a relationship with an immigrant that's from a different color of skin than yours, I would just encourage you to try to establish a relationship, right? And it's not like you're gonna, hey, now you're gonna come and be my immigrant friend, but to establish like a genuine, like horizontal relationship. And you'll be surprised by all the things you could learn. I learn a lot from people that are not like me. And so I always try to be in relationship with others who are different than me because I know I have a lot to learn. So I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah. Yep. And I think for me, some of the ways that happens, particularly as a person with a fair amount of privilege, and I don't know if this is kind of what you're talking about, Alejandro, or not, but is to show up where people are already showing up. So to show up at the protests around really terrible immigration policy and to show up for the teach-ins and to show up in those spaces if you don't already have like people in your lives who are immigrants or who look different than you. Those are the spaces, because then I think for those of us who are white especially, like, we have to earn that. We can't just assume that someone is going to want to be our friend. And so if we're showing up, if we're putting our bodies on the line, or we're engaging in education and activism, that whether it's in person or virtually, then we start to prove ourselves, to prove that we might actually be trustworthy.
Yes, you said it much more eloquently. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah,
it's not about take somebody to eat. It's about caring. And I don't know if, regardless of what people's believe in God, the universe, faith or lack of faith, but, just being a decent human being, it's about showing that you care. And when people need that, it will be a better way to show that you don't want to have a token friend, but you're actually interested in the person.
Yeah.
I would also say that if you're in a rural area or you're not particularly connected to political goings-ons, another place that I have found really wonderful to meet immigrants and people different from you is find a local community building volunteer experience that doesn't require you to spend money to volunteer. For example, if you volunteer to help out with the background logistical work of organizing the county fair, and you volunteer to help unload the truck when the truck shows up with all of the wonderful food that's going to be deep fried later that day, you will meet some really fantastic people, and very often that is a place where immigrants or people from that background will show up.
Thank you, Kate. That's great. Great suggestion. Well, wonderful. Thank you both, Emily and Kate, very much. This was really, really fun. I appreciate the invitation, and thank you for the work you both do.
Thanks for being on with us.
Our first reading for this episode is from Ezekiel chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. After being exiled to Babylon in 597 BCE, Ezekiel receives a vision, and God commissions Ezekiel to speak even when people don't want to listen.
So one of the themes for this passage is the idea of being sent. So God is sending Ezekiel to the people of Israel. And I was thinking about that. I'm trying to think of when people are sent, I guess with the understanding that the people they're being sent to might not listen and might not do anything different, right? But they're still sent.
Jonah.
Well, Jonah's different because Jonah is the one who does all the wrong things.
Well, yes, but he wasn't expecting the Ninevites to listen to him, and then they did, and that's what pissed him off, but yeah.
That's true. I was more thinking of non-biblical ones, since that's the connections we usually try and make. Because actually, now that you say that, I think I did think of Jonah, but...
I also just think of Jonah as a classic comic figure.
It's true. The epitome of a terrible prophet. Terribly successful. Anyway.
Speaking of movies that should star Muppets. Anyway.
Yes. I would like the worm to be a human. Everything else can come. But
this is becoming a subgenre for us, isn't
it? Who is the human in a Muppet movie? Yes.
How many Muppet stories?
The actual
point you were going for.
Yeah, I actually was thinking about Greta Thunberg. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right.
You got the Greta part right.
Yeah. The climate activist who took a boat to the United States, and it was one of those things that, like, you know, I imagine other countries just look at the U.S. and they're like, nothing's going to change ever. Because sometimes I feel that way.
Yeah.
But still, she was sent by herself, but, like, by the need of the climate activism to the U.S. to push for change. And I think that is happening with more and more frequency, that youth who are supposed to be kids and supposed to be able to be kids are being sent now. And I think part of that is on us as adults, that we're not doing the work that we should be doing to protect them and to make the world safe and
like when I was
livable.
That age, I was being sent to convince grown-ups to quit smoking, which A, didn't work, and B, wasn't always all that welcome, but I was adorable, so, you know, that helped. But that was a level of emotional responsibility I didn't really want. And also it didn't work. And so I can't imagine how much worse it would be if I felt like I was the chance for an entire country to fix climate change, and then, you know, the country is America. Have a nice time.
Really good luck.
Yikes.
Yeah, agreed. So that's why I was thinking of Ezekiel and going to the people of Israel who may not care and probably won't listen.
Yeah. I'm sure there have been a number of ambassadors in that situation, some of whom we would like, some of not so much. And I feel like there has to be a Harry Potter reference there somewhere, right?
Probably, but I didn't
like
look
Hagrid
that hard.
Going to the Giants or something.
Mm-hmm. Hagrid going to the Giants would work.
In verse 2, we read, "And when God spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. I heard God speaking to me." So if nothing else, this must have been a profoundly unsettling experience. I've watched a few seasons of Red vs. Blue, which is a web series created by using the video game Halo and some voice actors. They use the video game to make the visuals, and then they put voiceover content that creates the stories.
Interesting.
It's pretty fun, although the more seasons you watch, the more narratively depressing it gets. But the first couple seasons are just absolute sheer fun.
Right.
And there are a couple of characters in the series who are at various points disembodied for various reasons and can possess other people's bodies. And no matter how generally benevolent they may or may not be trying to be about it, in a few cases they're just, causing mayhem rather than being malicious. But the concept of having that happen is always deeply weird to the other characters in the show. And I have to imagine that really wouldn't change, because this goes on for a while, and no, they really don't get used to it. It's still weird.
Yeah, that seems like a hard thing to get used to.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the same verse and thinking about the spirit entering. The spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. And it reminded me of the Ghostbusters movie.
Ooh!
The newest Ghostbusters movie.
I figured.
Yeah. The only one worth mentioning at this point. When the ghost goes in and possesses the receptionist guy, and Maximum puts him on his feet and tries to rule the world with him, but...
Yeah, that doesn't so much work.
Yeah, he tries, which is not nothing.
I mean, I'm fairly certain that if Chris Hemsworth actually wanted to rule the world, he'd probably have more luck than the ghost did.
Probably true.
We should all be grateful that he's apparently not interested.
Yeah. I imagine that a God spirit entering a person is not quite as jarring as either of our examples.
I would hope not. And yet, also, still probably weird.
Yep. I mean, look at angels. What do you expect?
And they're covered with eyes all around, and they're covered with eyes all around. I may have written a version of that song for angels.
That's fantastic. And that is the first time that you have been the one to break out into song, I think.
It's been a while, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Congratulations. I'm excited for that to make it into our episode. And then in verse 3, we read, God said to me, Mortal, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this very day. This made me think of the Allegiant book, I believe, in the Divergent series, where we finally find out that the city of Chicago, the place that Divergent and Insurgent take place, the population has been sent there because of really bad human decisions, and then the descendants, which is the contemporary inhabitants for when the story takes place, make more bad human decisions.
Shocking.
I know, what a surprise. So that just reminded me, though, of the, welp, they're rebelling, let's try this thing. They're still rebelling, just in a new way. Anything more? Huh? Yeah.
It's not fair that this didn't happen when I was making notes for this episode, but when you said, a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me, I immediately heard that in Emperor Palpatine's voice. Then, later, in verse 4, we read, the descendants are impudent and stubborn. Okay, raise your hand if you are part of a ethnic, cultural, and or religious tradition that prides itself on being stubborn. I'm waving. I'm not saying that you shouldn't pride yourself on being stubborn necessarily, because there are times when that is a super useful and helpful trait. But recognizing the downsides is also important work to do. Mm-hmm. Just ask the vast majority of action heroes who also manage to destroy their personal lives by being action heroes. I'm just saying.
True.
This was actually not a matter of finding a good reference, as it was a matter of choosing one out of the thousands. So I decided to just go with the classic action hero.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It's your turn.
No, yeah. I was just pondering Tony Stark.
I was definitely thinking Bruce Willis. Although, to be fair, I think Bruce Willis's character in Red actually did do some of the work of recognizing why being an action hero isn't always the greatest idea. So.
That's impressive. Our second reading for this episode is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 2 through 10. Paul instructs Christians not to boast because we all have weaknesses and faults. No matter what those are, God's grace is all that we need, and also what we all need. So boasting, Paul definitely talks about boasting and whether or not he is boasting and who he's boasting for. And I'm on a pose kick because I just finished the series, which is phenomenal. And if you haven't watched it, you definitely should. Content notifications for lots of things, mature audience only, blah, blah, blah. But Pose, I think, is a great example of boasting because in the ballroom, they boast all the time. There is so much shade thrown around and so much boasting and bragging and pride in self. But the way that we think of boasting a lot of the times is that it's a negative thing or that it's an overinflated sense of self. And in the ballrooms in the show, there's a sense that it is a decided counterpunch to the rest of the dominant culture that is continually beating down on folks and telling them that they're not worth enough. And so then the ballroom comes up, and that's the place to boast about yourself, but then also to boast about your house. And thanks to Blanca, who is the best, it also becomes a place to lift up each other so that even those of you who are rivals or rival houses still are lifting up and supporting each other and boasting in the whole community, which is awesome.
Excellent. Personally, I never boast. I'm the most humble. In verse 2, we read, I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. But the real question is there frozen yogurt there, like in The Good Place? I have to say, Paul, I actually kind of doubt that you had this conversation personally with the person who had this experience, because the idea that this happened to someone and they didn't immediately start describing exactly what it was like there, and
or if it was in spirit or in body.
Yeah, or anything. Like, what did it look like? Who was there? What kind of food was there? There are so many people who have so many questions about what heaven is like, and this person answered almost none of them. And is it that Paul was, combing through the hours and hours and hours of monologuing that this person must have been doing and picking out the one or two details he actually thought were important? Because that totally sounds like Paul, and also I object. And, I would like to know if you can get real ice cream there, even if you actually are lactose intolerant. So these are the important questions, Paul, you're not explaining.
Although a froyo place, like the good place, not bad.
I don't necessarily object to froyo, but I can't have froyo either because I'm still lactose intolerant, and so if I'm going to, celebrate not having to worry about that.
Were you a Dole Whip person I don't know if y'all had frozen yogurt things in college. We did, and Dole Whip was the lactose-free
Oh,
option.
I did not actually find out I was lactose intolerant until after college.
Oh.
It explained a lot.
So. That makes sense. I was looking at verse 6 and thinking again about Divergent because I'm in the middle of listening to the Insurgent book on audio, but
cool.
As verse 6 says, "But if I wish to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me." The first part of the verse is just the reality that kids are brilliant at this, right? They can boast because it's all truthful, and they're just saying it like it is, and they don't know not to say that they're awesome because they are awesome.
Of course they are.
Yep, but the other piece is like, abnegation would be terrible at the first half and awesome at the second half, right? Paul sounds like abnegation, but I refrain from it so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me. Abnegation is the faction that is all about selflessness. And so, of course, they're not going to boast. They're not going to draw attention to themselves, but they will refrain.
Yeah. In verse 7, we read, "Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated." We don't know what this is for Paul, what his thorn in the flesh is, but I do find it at least somewhat reassuring that he can admit that he is somehow not perfect, or his life isn't perfect, or there is some kind of, flaw in existence in his universe, because that keeps him from going even further over the top irritating for me. But we do know in storytelling that in order for a character to be truly interesting, it really helps if that person has a flaw of some kind, preferably a character flaw, some characteristic of them that is sometimes a problem. And the number of times that I have explained this to writers who have asked me to beta their fanfic borders on the ridiculous, because no, not being great at math does not count as a character flaw. That is just a grade you got in middle school, dude. Please give them a character flaw. They don't have to always be magically perfect. You can allow them to be bad at being punctual. You can allow them to hold a grudge. You can allow them to be really terrible at picking up on other people's feelings, or whatever. Just give them something that makes them different and interesting, and that will help. Otherwise, I'm not going to care about them if they're magically perfect in every way, because they're not Mary Poppins, and she already holds that role.
And she even says practically perfect.
Exactly.
And if Mary Poppins isn't perfect, nobody is.
Right.
JK, that's actually about God. If God's not perfect. Wait, no.
No, God gets to be perfect, but God is the only one.
Yeah, that. Uh-huh.
Because in order for us to be interesting, we all have to be different. And God took that place first. And so the rest of us have to be flawed in some way. Congratulations. That's just how storytelling works.
Perfect. That's what I tell people when we lead worship together at the beginning. I'm like, just so you know, if we don't mess up at some point during this, then we're going to have to do it at the end just to make sure that we all know that we're not perfect. God is.
I mean, to be fair, there are certain kinds of mistakes I like to avoid. I had a professor who had a story about her shoes catching on fire in the middle of a service once. There was a Christmas tree, but anyway.
That sounds scary. Yeah, some mistakes can be avoided, but I've never had to on purpose make a mistake, so doing pretty good at being human.
Thank you for pretending for the rest of us.
I try. Another thing to point out, just to make sure we name this, is that there is some conversation around the thorn in Paul's side being sexual orientation stuff. And that's unknown and pretty complicated because the ways that we understand sexual orientation and sexuality and gender identity, all of those nowadays, is different than they understood them in Paul's time. So we can't quite see them the same way. And I think it can be a really life-giving thing for folks who are told that who they are is not good to hear that Paul's thorn in the side might be that he was gay and that God was like, nah, keep this. This is you. This is good.
Yeah.
And just Paul thought it was a thorn. But this is a passage that can be used really harmfully towards queer people. So be careful if you read it and if you preach it.
At this point, I can't read this verse without mentally picturing the cartoon of Paul in jail with SpongeBob SquarePants next to him. And SpongeBob is the thorn in his side because SpongeBob wants to keep talking all the time.
Oh yeah, SpongeBob would be the perfect thorn. Thorn in anybody's side.
So, that's been making the rounds of my various clergy groups for some years now.
Oh, nice. I haven't seen that one.
Okay, I will try to find it.
Okay, so in verse 9 we read, "But Christ said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." And this reminded me of the 4th book in the Graceling series, Winter Keep, which is the newest one that just came out in the last year, and Bitter Blue, who is this like queen and supposed to be powerful, and people in Winter Keep don't really know her history, but it is precisely because she can tell Lovisa, this young Winterkeep girl, about her past and her experiences and connect with her on that level, that they are able to connect and that Lovisa is able to trust her and to be with her. So it's that brave vulnerability like we talked about several episodes ago.
Great.
To be honest about our weaknesses, to be honest about when we're not doing great or when we mess up.
Yeah. Our gospel reading for this episode is from Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Jesus goes home, where they can't believe he's a prophet, let alone the Son of God, and instructs his disciples how to go about doing God's work, depending on the hospitality of the people they encounter.
So one of the themes for this passage that I noticed was hospitality. And again, we'll shoot to pose. All the way through the show, Blanca is the embodiment of hospitality. She is always gathering people in and providing hospitality for them, even to the very, very end. It's finding new people to be part of her house, part of the house of Evangelista, whether she's the mother or the grandmother, but to welcome people, to give people second chances when they realize they messed up and have done some work around that, but to welcome people back in always. And I think she's a great model of what it can mean to be hospitable, and as queer people who create our own family, that happens a lot, of welcoming new people into our families and broadening and deepening our support.
Excellent. In verse 5, we read, "And Jesus could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them." Excuse me, Jesus, this is plenty powerful for a deed.
Right, I always think that.
Yeah, or did they just have a slight cold or something and you cleared them up of the sniffles? Is that what went on? I don't know. The TV show House had a whole episode center around the concept of a faith healer, and it was super powerful of a concept for them. I mean, okay, yes, it turned out that guy was actually a fraud, but that's beside the point. Stop putting yourself down, Jesus. We believe in you.
Amen. Yeah, I always get confused about that verse because I'm like, he could do nothing except for this and that. And the other. In verse 8, we read, Jesus ordered the 12 to take nothing for their journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in their belts. And this made me think about migration and the ways that people migrate across borders. And for some people, if they are fleeing violence, it is a fast thing and you might not have bread, bag, money.
Yeah.
And even for those who are as well prepared as they could possibly be, crossing the border, each step along the way, things get left behind.
Yeah.
So, for example, along the river, there's frequently clothes that are left behind when people get out of the river and put on new clothes that are dry. Or in the desert, you can see people dropping backpacks, dropping whatever they need to drop in the hopes that they can make it to the next water station, to the next road, to the next place to find safety and shelter. I mean, it's a system that we have set up in this country so that only the hardiest of workers get through so that they can be exploited as much as possible, which is awful. Yeah, it is a terrible thing, and it is a real thing that people experience.
Yeah.
Not just across our southern border, but throughout the world as people flee violence and economic and environmental disasters.
Yeah. On a lighter note, I also read that verse, and my immediate thought was of my grandpa. I have previously mentioned on the show that one of my grandpas was an engineer, and the idea of doing this, of going somewhere without taking the necessary stuff and not planning ahead, would have given him the screaming heebie-jeebies, to use a technical term.
Mm-hmm.
His rule was however many days long the trip was going to be, that's how many months ahead you would start planning it. So if you were going to take a 6-day trip, you started planning it 6 months out. And by you, I mean him. When my aunt, his youngest child, and who was, for his entire life, the only person who could talk him into things that no one else could talk him into, when she was a teen, she managed to talk him into a few road trips where they didn't make reservations at hotels ahead of time. They just kept driving until they found a place to stay. And for decades after this, he spoke about these trips with a sense of wonder at the idea that he had ever dared to try it in the first place. Until the day he died. It was so deeply unsettling for him. But this is also the guy who actually enjoyed balancing his checkbook by hand. So that kind of tells you what type of nerd he was.
I don't write checks, otherwise I would probably also enjoy balancing my checkbook by hand.
I do write checks, and I greatly appreciate the online banking system that does my math for me. It's not that I couldn't do the math, it's that I appreciate someone else being willing to do it for me, even if it's a computer program.
That's fair. I love math.
I love math too. I just don't want to have to do it all the time.
In verse 11, Jesus continues the instructions for the 12 and says, "If any place will not welcome you, and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." The immediate thing that always happens when I think about feet and leaving people is the person who threw the shoe at President Bush. Yeah. When he was in Iraq, I think. But that's a big insult, right? Culturally, that's a big insult. Sure. And so thinking about that as shake the dust off your feet. But I also, when I was on internship, we were using this series from Rob Bell. And one of the episodes, I will probably always go back to this episode, but it talks about ashes, and that the saying is, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi." So the idea is that you're following so closely behind that you get covered in their dust. And so then I was thinking about that in connection with this shaking the dust off your feet, that you don't want to carry any evidence of your presence in that place to anywhere else, because it might be misconstrued as an endorsement, right? Just because I went to school at this place does not mean I think that other people should go to school at this place. Or just because I was here for whatever reason doesn't mean that I think it's a safe place for everybody. So that sort of like, don't accidentally endorse terrible things. Don't follow J.K. Rowling.
Yeah. I have donated a handful of t-shirts to Goodwill and various places like that for similar reasons.
Yeah, which is then also hard because then somebody else picks them up and wears them. And well, thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss the nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 7th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want to access our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.